All right, let's at least begin getting started. So yeah, let's just talk some business for a second. So I sent out the rubric to everyone. I don't know when this paper is going to be due. Indeed, so everything's taking me about 25% longer. Like we're going about 25% slower in class. It takes me 25% longer to get ready for class. Everything's just taking a bit longer doing it this way. Um, I'm thinking, this isn't definite yet, this isn't settled yet. I'm thinking of just dropping the last paper altogether. So what that would look like is there would only be now one required paper in the class. So people who already wrote a paper are done writing papers, no new papers. People who, you can write another one, I suppose, if you weren't happy with your grade on it. And then everyone else, which is most of the class, will just write the second paper. And so what we'll probably, if we go that route, I'm not certain yet, but if I go that route, what I'll probably do is just expand the second unit and really shorten the third one. Because we're just behind and we're getting more and more behind every day, it looks like, from where I was sort of hoping we'd be. And so as a result, we were already probably going to have to shorten that third unit anyway. And what I really don't want to do is give you two papers due really close to one another. If the papers are going to have to be due really close, I'd rather just have there be one paper and just get rid of the third one altogether. So that's not settled. The rubric that I sent you, the due date is to be determined. The earliest it would be, and I don't think it will be this early, but the earliest it would be the 19th now. It might even be a little bit later than that. At which point, if it goes any later than that, it'll be the last required paper. So we'll cut the third paper out, and everyone will have to turn in one paper. Not ideal. It's not my favorite option, but nothing we're doing right now is ideal or my favorite option. So making the best of what we've got, that's the goal. Go ahead. You're unmuted.
Okay, so does that mean that if we didn't do the first paper and we do the second paper and the third paper's cut, we're only graded on the one paper we've turned in?
That's exactly right. There will only be one paper. And again, this isn't settled yet, but if we go that way, it'll basically be how much we get done today. If we don't get caught up today, I'm going to have to do this. But if we don't get caught up today, then there will only be one paper required. So people who already turned in the first paper, they don't have another paper to write. And people who did not turn in that first paper will have to do the second one.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And yeah, I'll know pretty much after today. If I can somehow get through this whole Badal article today, there still may be a chance. I'm guessing we're probably not going to do that though, but we'll see. So that's what it'll look like. Go ahead. You should be unmuted.
So if we decide to do paper instead of the presentation, would that be separate, right?
Yes, so for people who are doing papers instead of their presentation, that paper is sort of separate. That's still the presentation grade. You still have we'll have the same normal presentation assignment that people always had in the past done. It's just now people can fulfill that requirement in a couple different ways, one of them being a paper.
Okay, but like there is no rubric for it, right? Yet?
No, yeah, the rubric is basically the exact same as the presentation requirements are. So you have to it should be about 4 to 5 pages. It should include 2 secondary sources, and it should be about the same topic. It should be just using philosophy to explain interesting things in some science fiction work that you're interested in.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Absolutely. There was another hand.
Yeah, could you reveal real quickly what the plan is going forward for the presentation? Or we're just kind of figuring out what that would look like individually?
That's right. We're planning what it's going to look like individually. So for this, at least for everyone who was planning to present last week and this week, all of those people chose to do a paper instead, which is fine. And so we've worked that out sort of individually. So in terms of presentations, just get in touch with me and we'll work out the format that works best for you. I know some people are planning on making videos, and then I'll probably just post those videos on the class YouTube page, actually. And a couple people have expressed an interest, though no one's sort of finalized this yet, in doing their presentation over Zoom, which is also an option. That's also something that can be done, and then it would look very much like it did before. You have 10 to 12 minute presentation with a couple minutes for question at the end. So yeah, for the specifics for each individual person, come speak with me and we'll figure out sort of what works best for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. So that's some business. Any other business questions? My guess is it's not ideal for me to have to cancel that third paper. My guess is none of you will be horribly disappointed if I do. I could be wrong. Maybe some of you were really looking forward to it. But it's not ideal. I don't like changing the syllabus, but we might just have to. We've already had to change the syllabus in various sorts of ways. So I'll probably know really just by how today's class goes if there's any chance of getting back on track, or if not, then yeah, we'll just cancel that last paper and make that work. Let's talk a little bit about what this second paper will contain, what it's about. Unlike the first paper, there's only one topic, really. You can choose your own as well, but there's only one topic I'm giving you. We've got these three possible candidates for living things, right? We're using sort of Star Trek as our sort of example, right? So we've got the Horta, right? Silicon-based life form, or at least a life form, right? A potential life form, something that maybe some people are tempted to call a life form, and Star Trek at the very least did want to. We have Data, so a cybernetic organism, right? Or an android, as Star Trek calls it, but they're really cyborgs actually. A cybernetic organism, so a synthetic man-made thing, but still a discrete sort of physical entity. This is a possible candidate for a life form. And then finally, we had a purely digital life form, the holographic doctor, right? And where we now have a completely man-made thing that doesn't even have, in the usual sense of the term, at least a physical body. We'll talk about to what extent such a digital life form could perhaps be said to have a body or not to have one, starting a little bit today and then more when we move on to the entropic definition of life. So we've got these three plausible candidates. Your task in the paper, which of the three, if any, should we count as a life form? And so to answer that question, you're going to have to offer some account of what life means. There's a bunch of different possible candidates, right? We're looking at a bunch in class. You can come up with your own as well. But for this paper, you need to respond to at least 3 of the authors we've read this semester. Okay? And there'll be 3 pretty compelling, but as we get sort of closer, or get farther in this unit, there'll be 3 pretty obvious choices. Badao is a pretty obvious choice, who we're going to start talking about today a little bit. And then there'll be a few other pretty obvious choices too as we sort of go through. So you have to address 3 of the authors we've used. You don't have to endorse necessarily any of their conclusions. You could come up with your own account of what life is, and that's perfectly fine. But you have to at least respond to the accounts of life that you find in 3 of the authors that we've looked at. Paper should be 4 to 5 pages, so the same rough length as the first one. Aim for about 5, right? That should be your goal. But if it's a little shorter than 5, that's fine. But aim for something like that. If it's a little over, that's not the end of the world. I can live with it. Make sure you include the statement of academic integrity, right? As it says in the rubric, just that you're utilizing your own resources or you're citing outside resources that you used. No outside resources are required, but if you do use any, just make sure to cite them properly. I don't care what format you use. You can use any citation style you like, just so long as I can find what it is you've looked at. All right. So I have questions about the rubric. I have a chat question. Yeah, so the question on the chat, this is just sort of a refreshing question. So if I do cancel the third paper, the requirement will only be that students have to turn in 1 paper throughout the semester, right? So if you already turned in the first paper, you're done. If you didn't turn in the first paper, you'll have to write the second. That's what we'll do if we go the route of having to cancel that third paper. Any other questions, either on business or about the paper itself? I saw a few hands, I thought. Yeah, Rachel, go ahead. Go ahead. There we go.
So I don't know what happened with my computer connection, but I lost you there for a good 5 minutes. So I'm pretty lost with what's happening.
So just to refresh for other people who have come in later as well, just a reminder, I might need to cancel the third paper. We might just be so far behind that I would have to make the papers due too close to one another for that to be fair to you all. So if I do that, if I end up canceling the third paper, what that'll be is we'll just change the requirement to there being only one required paper. So if you turned in the first one, you won't have to turn in another one. Otherwise, you'll have to turn in the second paper. So we'll basically just be getting rid of the third paper and making students only turn in one paper. Does that help? Does that answer?
Yeah, I think so. I just don't know what happened with my computer. It just it kicked me out of the meeting like 3 times. And
Yesterday, my
I-
computer crashed so hard in the middle of something that I had to reinstall the program I was using, which I've never seen before. Yeah, computers are
God.
funky and things are going a little bit weird these days.
Holy cow! Well,
So, but yeah, so and like I said, I'll try to figure out as soon as I possibly can if I am in fact going to cancel that last paper. The earliest this second paper is going to be due is going to be April 19th. That'll be the earliest for it. So should have a good couple weeks to work on it at a minimum.
I talk too much a lot. How long is too long? Like if I get on to like 6.5-ish, would that get me in trouble?
Just keep in mind that I have to grade a lot of these papers.
Yeah, I figured.
So do it as a, if it's 6, if it's 7, that's probably fine, but don't do what someone has genuinely done before, turn in a 15-page paper to me.
Oh God.
When it was supposed to be 5. Don't do that.
I'll aim for 5 and it might bleed onto the 7th page, but no more.
I can live with that. Just, I've got a lot of these papers to grade, so just keep that in mind when you're deciding upon your length.
Yeah.
Go ahead, you should be unmuted.
So more specific question about the paper. You said we could talk about any entity, whether it could be life form. So let's say if the specific one I have in mind is the Eva from Ex Machina, would that be all right, even though there was presentation on it?
Sure, yes, she would sort of fit within the kind of data kind of life form, aside the sort of the cybernetic organism. Because yes, she's not purely digital. She does in fact have sort of like a physical body in that context. But sure, if you'd rather use her than data, that's fine. Yeah, I just want you to look at those 3 broad categories. So sort of like a silicon thing, a cybernetic type thing, and a digital type thing. It doesn't have to necessarily be the ones from Star Trek.
Okay, awesome, thanks.
Absolutely. Good, any other questions? My recommendation in terms of this paper, we're going to need to at least do a little bit of progress on the entropic definition of life before you'll really be able to do the paper in earnest. That's why I've pushed the due date back a little bit already. So probably wait until at least early next week before you start this paper, maybe even late next week, because the entropic one is really going to play an important, the entropic definition is really going to play an important role too. So, yeah, that's part of the reason I need to push the paper back. This isn't one you could really start working on until we get most of the way through the unit anyway, because we need the 3 different accounts. We need basically what are going to be the 3 sort of different accounts that we're going to look at and consider as plausible candidates. And the entropic one is the last one. So, any other business questions? All right. So the irony of all of this is that all of this business discussion has indeed pushed us even further behind today, inevitably. So okay, let's now let's turn into the Badao article. And we also need to finish some of the stuff with the mayor. So we'll do both. My guess is we're not going to finish the Badao today. I'm hoping we can at least make some progress in it. We'll finish the mayor and start the Badao article. So let's turn to the mayor. Let's just begin by reviewing where we sort of left off. Okay. So Mayer argues that living things display purposeful behaviors, right? This is one of the sort of preeminent difference makers or markers that indicate that something is a life form, according to Mayer. Okay, what do we mean by a purposeful behavior? These are behaviors that are, in some loose sense of the word, teleological, right? They're oriented toward accomplishing some task, and you don't explain the behavior if you don't explain what the behavior is trying to accomplish, right? And so it was the difference between what he said, saying that the bird moved south and then found food versus saying the bird moved south for the winter in order to find food, right? That was the purpose of the behavior. And Mayer's argument is that you can't explain the bird's behavior unless you understand it is in some loose sense of the word teleological, right? These teleological sort of properties, these purposeful behaviors, they're emergent properties that are unique to living systems. right? They're not found in physicochemical substances that make up the living systems. So we can't just reduce biology to physics and chemistry. The compounds that are discovered by physicists and chemists play obviously a crucial role in how these living systems work, right? We're not made of something else. We've rejected vitalism, right? But the living system isn't reducible to its physicochemical properties, right? It has these emergent properties, these teleonomic properties, these sort of specialized behaviors. Okay, what sense of teleology is useful to the biologist? It's this, in particular, what he's calling teleonomic behavior, right? And this is what he defined as goal-directed behaviors or processes that operate on the basis of a program. And what he thinks is important about this definition, it avoids falling into the trap of thinking that evolution itself is a purposeful process. It's not, as far as he's concerned. Evolution, by its nature, is not teleological. Evolution is not evolving us to be good at any particular thing, right? Natural selection, always, the way he puts it, is rewards past behavior. It doesn't predict future behavior, right? So it rewards successful adaptations. It doesn't predict or call for new adaptations in the future that will come to be successful. But what evolution explains is teleonomic behaviors in individual organisms, right? And how it does so is evolution and natural selection pressures. These generate the, quote unquote, the program that sort of determine these teleological behaviors in living things. So what does he mean by a program? This is sort of the key term, and he's the one who introduces this language, which is why we're reading him. Right? By program, he means, think computer program. I mean, that's the image here. That's the paradigm he's using. We mean something that, one, contains a goal or endpoint state to be reached. So in the case of the computer program that's going to display hello world on the screen, right? The end or goal point of that program is indeed hello screen world getting drawn onto the screen. The program also gives instructions about how that goal or endpoint is realized. So the code tells the various computer hardware systems to engage in various kinds of changes such that hello world in fact shows up on the screen. And then finally, this program contains sort of feedback mechanisms that can handle disruptions to the execution of the program, right? It can handle errors. It can handle what if I'm clicking on my mouse button at the same time that the code is supposed to be operating. Or in the case of a living thing, what if I want to go eat that deer over there, but the deer is on the other side of a cliff and I would fall off the cliff and die if I actually went to pursue the deer, right? It can handle that sort of disruption of the eating subroutine, right? By moving around the cliff to get to the deer. So the program has all three of these things, and the reason why Mayer thinks this talk of program is really important is that it lets these sort of these teleonomic behaviors be explained scientifically, right? And be explained in a way that are perfectly compatible with what's going on with physics and chemistry. A program, in the cases of a living thing, the sort of archetypical program is the DNA molecule, and the DNA molecule is a chemical substance, right? It's entirely explicable. There's nothing supernatural about it. There's nothing mystical about it. Right? It's a physical thing. It's a very complicated physical thing. And it has various sorts of other really complicated mechanisms within the cell by which those DNA instructions get executed. Right? But it's fundamentally a physical thing. It precedes the behavior that it's supposed to explain. So you get the right sort of causal order. Cause comes first, program comes first, effect comes second, behavior comes second. Right? And it also sort of allows us to distinguish sort of rigorously what we actually mean by purposeful behavior, rather than this just sounding like something really fluffy or vague or hard to define. We can define the operation of a program pretty precisely. So as Mayer's drawing it, and this is just the last piece of review, I'll jump back as soon as we get done with the review. This account of program or teleonomy is quite deliberately broad, right? He's developing it using resources from cybernetics, from information theory, and from computer sciences, amongst other things. Right? And also, of course, from resources from biology. And that's purposeful. That's a feature, not a bug as far as he's concerned. The idea of teleonomy itself may well not be specific to life forms. As far as he's concerned, you can use teleonomic behavior to describe a wide variety of things. It can certainly explain the operation of life forms, right? And it can explain the operation of really simple life forms, right? DNA can explain why the single-celled organism does what it does. But also there's more sophisticated programs and more complex organisms. The programming for my organic body as a human being is my DNA, but it's also an open-ended program that also includes learning, cognitive programs, and various things of that sort as well. So we can account for a lot of different kinds of life forms with this teleonomic language. But we can also account for things that maybe we're suspicious about calling life forms. Complex computer systems, they also display teleonomic behavior. They're purposeful in what the program is doing. Even really simple human pieces of technology, things like clocks, they also show teleonomic behavior, right? You can't understand what a clock is doing if you don't understand that what it's doing is trying to tell time or trying to keep time. The clock does indeed have a program. It's in that case an entirely analog program that's built into the gears, right, and how the gears operate. But nevertheless, there is a program it is executing, and just the program and the execution mechanism are in the simple thing one and the same. All of these things have teleonomic properties. So for Mayer, just having teleonomic properties isn't a sufficient definition of life, but all living things will indeed have teleonomic behaviors. So let's pause for a second. All that was just review from what we went over, from what we talked about last class. So any questions, comments, or thoughts about any of that material?
So Mayer was saying that teleonomic properties are a necessary condition, but not sufficient, or the other way around?
That's right. They're necessary, but not sufficient. There's going to be a little bit more to life forms than just having teleonomic properties. Because especially clocks, he might be fine with actually even saying computer programs are alive, maybe, but he's not going to be fine with saying a clock is alive. Right. So that has teleonomic properties too. That also displays emergent properties that are more than just the sum of their physical-chemical parts. But that one's not a life form, so we're going to have to say a little bit more about what makes the life form ones life forms. Does that help? Yeah. And that's what we'll do today. That's one of the things that Badal, Mayer's project isn't really to define life at all. That's not exactly what he's trying to do. Badal is actually very explicitly trying to define life, and so he's going to emphasize that not all teleonomic systems are living systems, and then he's going to try to specify which ones are the living ones.
Yeah, because the Badal reading referenced Mayer.
Yes.
And how he was letting kind of too much through the door, but he didn't really care too much about it. He was kind of just settled on the concept of teleonomic.
Yeah, Badal's stance is going to be that he really, really likes Mayer and thinks Mayer is really giving a really good account. But he thinks that Mayer's just not asking the question of what life is, right? Mayer just basically is going to give us a list of properties life forms possess. And for other reasons that we'll talk about when we get to the Badal just doesn't think that's satisfactory. He thinks we're going to need more than that to actually explain what makes something actually alive versus not. And he's going to do that with saying the teleonomic properties are explained by this concept of supple evolution. Right? And that explains why the clock, right? We would never use evolutionary principles to explain how the clock emerged. Right? And so therefore, yeah, at the very least, a different science is going to study how that clock got made than the science that studies how things that evolved through evolutionary forces got quote unquote made. Good. Any other initial questions? All right, then let's finish up with the Mayer. Hopefully I can do this in like maybe 15 minutes or so. We'll see. All right, so there's a couple questions we should be left with. All Mayer so far has done, and indeed this is quite useful, he's given us a rigorous way to sort of define and distinguish precisely what properties we're talking about when we're talking about these teleonomic properties. And that's quite valuable, quite useful, right? In living things, how do these teleonomic properties actually emerge? That's sort of the next question that needs to be asked. How do we get them? Because again, how do clocks get them? Clocks get them as a result of the operation of human clockmakers. Right? We don't want to say, though, that living things were made in that same sense. So how were living things, again, if you want to use the word made at all, if that's appropriate, how are living things made? What is the sort of mechanism by which these teleonomic properties emerge in living things? And the answers are not surprising. It's the two big things in modern biology, right? The two innovations that make modern biology, not just organic chemistry. Right? There's genetics and evolutionary theory. Evolutionary natural selection. So how does this work? Genetics offers the most basic and fundamental program. In all living things that we've encountered, at least. Now, could we encounter something that doesn't have DNA and RNA? But rather has some different way that its program emerges? Maybe. Right? Mayer doesn't talk about it. He's just not, again, he's just not interested in that question, right? That's not what he's doing. He's talking about all the life forms we've encountered. All the life forms we've encountered, at least, their most elementary program is either DNA or RNA or some combination of. And that's also, similarly, the mechanisms by which DNA and RNA get executed, right? The various protein and enzyme syntheses that take place. These are sort of the elementary building blocks out of which the program and its execution emerge in all living things. Maybe there could be other kinds of programs in living things, but Mayer just doesn't consider this possibility. Right? He's just not concerned with it. He's assuming that you need sort of certain chemicals. Everything we've encountered needs very specific kinds of chemical interactions, especially, let's say, metabolic ones.
And wouldn't the reproductive stuff fall under like only DNA? Because that's how anything we know of reproduces is through its RNA or DNA.
Yes, and indeed, those would also fit. Any sort of reproductive system would also sort of fit in. That's right. And so maybe all living things are going to have to reproduce in some way, but maybe they don't need DNA to do it. Maybe we could find some weird alien form of life that uses something else. Or maybe some kind of digital form of life that has the digital equivalent of DNA, but not the actual specific chemicals that we've encountered in normal carbon-based life forms. Yeah. Right. So this is where the program comes from. At least in all life as we know it, the program comes from a genetic code of some sort. Right? And then, we have more complicated open-ended systems. That don't just rest in DNA, but they all start there. Right? So there's more to your program, the program that governs your behavior, than just your DNA. Right? But you started with that DNA first. That was sort of what got the ball rolling and allowed these more complicated systems, things like memory, for example, to emerge. Right? It emerged as a result of the sort of chain of behavior that was begun by your initial strand of DNA when you were a unicellular dividing zygote, right, in the womb. So that's the first sort of way in which these properties emerge. How did DNA emerge, though? How does the specific programs of specific life forms emerge? That emerges by natural selection. Natural selection pressures reward members with sort of novel mutations in their program, right? Because if those programs cause certain behaviors and those behaviors are actually successful, the organism will be able to reproduce. And so that good mutation gets rewarded. And so as a result, organisms display what Badal actually calls intelligent behavior, even if they themselves are not intelligent. Because the unintelligent ones die off. And so these are the two sort of special tools that biologists are going to use to explain teleonomic behavior. And both of these tools make no sense in the context of physics or chemistry, right? Nothing else other than living things have DNA or RNA. And nothing else does it make sense to use evolutionary natural selection principles to explain why those things have the properties that they do. Not crystals as we normally think of them, not fire, not this, that, or the other thing. Like nothing else other than life forms. And note how these two things work together, right? These things entirely work together. DNA provides the program, natural selection provides a sort of refinement and tuning of that program to actually be purposeful, intelligible behavior. All right. So let's stop for a second. How we all doing with any of that? Any questions about either of those sort of explanatory mechanisms? This isn't super specific, and Mayer's straightforward about that. I mean, how does all of this work? I don't know, take a biology class, right? I mean, like, it all works in a really, really complicated way, right? I mean, there's a reason organic chemistry is one of the hardest classes at any university, right? Because the actual specifics of the mechanism are really complicated, and that's what it is that biologists study, right? But that's no different from anything else, right? The actual mechanisms of quantum randomness are also really complicated, and that's what quantum physicists study. So biology studies with these sort of special tools. The specifics are complicated, and to get into the specifics, you just have to become a biologist, which I am not, and so I will not embarrass myself or devalue the educative experience by pretending to be. Right? I don't understand the actual specifics, but the broad framework that Mayer's letting out, it's a perfectly understandable framework, and it's a framework that's really different than the one used by either physicists or chemists. And I don't need to be either a biologist, a physicist, or a chemist to understand how this framework for explanation is different than the kinds of frameworks that get used in physics and chemistry. So any questions on any of these points so far? All right, then let's keep moving on a little bit. One last point about Mayer before we move on. Mayer argues that, this is just a little bit of a historical note. Aristotle said all of this already. Right? He just was wrong on the specifics. So Aristotle talked about forms and souls and whatever those actually mean. Mayer thinks, like, if you just replace the word form with DNA, or species form with the DNA, everything Aristotle said works pretty great, right? And it actually accounts for quite nicely what it is that biologists are actually pointing toward. Aristotle also said a bunch of other stuff that was wrong. But Mayer actually thinks that most of the stuff that he said is wrong was generalizing from biology to the other sciences. Using the same resources he used in biology to account for physical motion, or, I mean, there's not like chemistry in Aristotle, so just like to account for things like physical motion or astronomy, right? Sort of treating biology as the preeminent science, right? That was Aristotle's mistake. But that's not actually a problem with him as a biologist. He's a great biologist, and indeed Mayer thinks that in a very real sense, modern biology is still kind of using the same framework he initiated. That's actually what was actually sort of the big innovation. That is this sort of, or what Mayer was calling this organicism, is precisely not trying to explain life forms the same way we try to explain physical objects. Aristotle was already right there. He already sort of had this recognition that biology is going to have its own sort of explanatory principles. So Mayer wants to redeem Aristotle a little bit. Mayer's not really an expert in ancient philosophy, so a lot of what he says about both Plato and Aristotle is, we're not going to bother. We're not going to bother about the specifics of it. That what Plato and Aristotle are doing is really different, also, than what modern biology is doing, because of how they're understanding what Mayer is calling metaphysics and doesn't really understand super well, like what's going on with it. Plato and Aristotle are also doing metaphysical things that's not particularly in the sphere of what Mayer's looking at, but I think it is the case, and you see, actually, I see a lot of biologists saying this, that the most useful philosopher on biology is probably Aristotle, at least the classical philosopher. He was the one who was saying and doing the most interesting things, and that actually Descartes and Descartes' model just isn't actually very helpful for talking about living things, really. That the Aristotelian one is actually the far more helpful framework for the biologists to use to understand what they're doing. So just a little bit of a historical note. And that's where Mayer basically ends the piece. So that's the end of the Mayer. Again, how are we doing? Questions or thoughts or comments so far? Okay. Here's where we've ended up. Let's just, so we can keep track of the forest through the trees a little bit. All living things have teleonomic emergent behaviors. Therefore, biology is not reduced to physics or chemistry. One key point, and this is one that is going to be repeated in the Badao. This means living systems can't be predicted if you have a perfect knowledge of all the molecules in living systems. The behaviors are more than and not predictable simply on the basis of all of the atoms, right? All of the parts. And Badao is going to make this really explicit. Badao is actually going to say this isn't just not predictable by like us flawed humans or whatever. He means not predictable in kind. There is no way Badao thinks to predict how a system will evolve besides seeing how the system evolves. You could not know in advance, even if you were a perfect supercomputer, you would not be able to predict in advance how a system would evolve. So any questions or thoughts? Caleb, are you raising your hand? You're really tiny, so I can't actually see you. Give me the thumbs up or something. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So what's the difference between teleonomic and teleological?
Teleologic is a broader category. So there's all kinds of things that in the past have been properly described as teleological in a sense, but that are not the kind of teleonomic behavior that Mayer is pointing toward. So for example, when people talk about evolution as if evolution is intending to create more intelligent life forms, maybe. That's wrong, first of all, but it's also a teleological understanding of evolution, and it's a bad one. It's one that Mayer does not want to use. Or you could have a teleological understanding of the universe as a whole. That all of the universe is intending to imitate the eternal to the extent possible, or whatever. That's what Aristotle says at one point. And that's a teleological account, but again, not one useful for biology. Maybe be useful in the context of metaphysics, maybe it wouldn't. That's a separate question. But at the very least, it's not useful biologically. Teleonomic is one specific kind of purposeful behavior and it's the kind that he thinks is helpful. Does that help?
Yeah, that's good.
And what specifies is the idea of the program. That's what actually specifies it. That's the sort of unique thing about the teleonomic behaviors, is that they're programmed. They're program driven. All right, good. Any other questions from the mayor? Okay. All right, so if we're good here, then now let's use this to actually come up with a definition of life. And that takes us to Bedau. That's what Bedau wants to basically do. He's going to use this sort of account of teleonomic properties. He's not really going to even go into any sort of great depth about it. He's just going to presuppose it in the background. That's why he cites the mayor and sort of mentions his debt to mayor, but he's not even going to bother going into any sort of depth with what he means by teleonomic, because he's going to just presuppose it and now use that as sort of a framework or a definitive property that can be used to define life forms. And the way he's going to proceed, so just to give you the punchline first, the way he's going to proceed, what explains the teleonomic behavior in the things that we are interested in as life forms, that's what makes them alive. That's how we're going to sort of define it, and that's how we'll identify novel forms of life. If the same explanation explains things with teleonomic properties, it'll count as a life form. And so we'll just, to cut to the chase for Bedau, what are we going to let in? Almost anything in principle could be let into the club. We're silicone-based life forms, they're fine. We can explain silicone-based life forms using the language he's going to use, the cause is supple, what he's going to call supple adaptation. Or he also calls it open-ended in a couple places. Anything that is explained or caused by supple open-ended adaptation counts. Could silicon things be explained in this way? Sure. So in principle, silicon-based life form could count. Could a cybernetic thing be explained in this way? Sure, in principle, some cybernetic organisms at least could perhaps be explained through the process of supple or open-ended adaptation, at which point they would count. Could digital things count? Sure, if I've got a computer system in which a bunch of programs are struggling and fighting for memory resources and evolving new versions, new forms of behavior to try to better utilize energy and memory, then sure, those digital things count. This is the broadest of the definitions. The Schrodinger one's going to be narrower. This is a much broader definition of life. Anything that supple, open-ended adaptation explains the behaviors of counts as a life form. And this fits with Mayer, so none of this contradicts anything that Mayer said, right? Mayer just wasn't interested in this specific project, right? Mayer was just interested in defining teleonomy really broadly such that it can apply to things like clocks. But then he was also really interested in the specific mechanisms of what biologists study, and basically the mechanisms that biologists study, they study this supple open-ended adaptation process. Right? They study it in terms of DNA. That might be accidental. What's more important is the supple open-ended adaptation process itself, rather than the specific mechanisms that life that we've encountered uses in that process. So that's just very broad framework. I just wanted to start and give you sort of a broad roadmap of where we're going to go with the Bedau, because it's going to get complicated. But again, any questions, thoughts, comments before we dive into the weeds a little bit? Everyone good so far? All right, then let's dive into the weeds. All right. Let's just start here. Life is really complex, diverse, and multifaceted. Let's just start by talking about stuff we all agree about. Like, you know how weird it is that we use the same word to describe a mushroom, a giant red oak tree, you, and something so tiny it can only be seen with a microscope. That's really weird, right? Is anyone else, maybe it's just me, is anyone else freaked out by mushrooms? I find mushrooms kind of creepy. You cut into a mushroom, right? And it's like homogeneous all the way through. Like it's the same, like it's like the solid white all the way through. That's pretty weird. That creeps me out a little bit actually, right? Because if I cut like myself in half, okay, it's not going to last very long, but for the few seconds that I can sort of look inside of myself, right, I'm not going to see something homogeneous at all. I'm going to see this incredibly diverse organ structure, right, where all the organs are really different. That looks nothing like a mushroom when you cut it in half. And it also doesn't really look anything like a tree when you cut the tree in half either, right? Or not even to say what happens when you cut the single cellular organism in half. It's not even clear what that even means at that point. All of those things are so wildly diverse. They look so different and they act so differently. Right? They are things that live eating sulfur out of hot deep sea vents. If I just put you in a deep sea vent, you would die immediately. You'd be crushed, let alone make you have to somehow get nourishment out of that deep sea vent. Right? There are bacteria that can survive in the vacuum of space and eat rocks. There are, conversely, things that are so complex that a tiny little change in their environment caused them to completely break down. Like, for example, I don't know, you all. If I lower the temperature just, 50 degrees Celsius, a lot of you are going to die. Right? Because you're not capable, well, it depends on where you are, I guess, right? Yeah, at least if you're in Colorado today, where it's quite cold, if I lowered the temperature 50 degrees Celsius more, you would all die pretty quickly. Right? You couldn't withstand it. But because you are so well adapted to the narrow range of temperatures that you do inhabit, you can do things that those sulfur bacteria never could even imagine. You can talk, you can build computers, you can build Zoom, you can teach classes on Zoom. Truly, aren't we astounding things, right? Those behaviors are so different than all the behaviors of other life forms. But again, it's not just us that engage in weird behaviors. I mean, have you ever seen like what the things that penguins do? You ever watch like Planet Earth or something, right? Like penguins are weird and they do wacky behaviors of their own that we humans could not do ourselves. Every form of life is diverse and weird. That's sort of where Vidal's starting point is. When we look at life, we see something really diverse, complex, and multifaceted, right? It's really complicated, but complicated in different ways. And in the terms that we've been developing using the Mayer, what does that sort of concretely mean? It means radically different teleonomic behaviors are found in different organisms. And to him, this is sort of the definitive phenomenon, right? What are we interested in? Why are we interested in life forms, but not like chemical reactions? Why do we just not find chemical reactions as cool as we find my cat? It's because of the enormous diversity of behaviors we see in living things. If we can even talk about behavior at all about a rock, its behaviors are really boring and simple, right? And every rock has basically the same behavior. What is the rock's behavior? We'll use Luigi as my example of a rock. It falls, and that's it. Right? It's boring, and it's the same for all the different kinds of rocks. They all basically do the same kind of thing. Life forms do so many different things and so many different things across the different kinds of life forms. That's his starting point. So interesting, different, diverse teleonomic behavior. As a result of this, he thinks it's really hard to define life. Since the phenomenon is just so diverse. And these are just the life forms we've seen. Imagine how many life forms are out there in this infinite universe of ours, or even in this nearly infinite, for the human perspective, galaxy of ours. How many other kinds of life forms out there that engage in even crazier behaviors, even more different kinds of behaviors we've never even seen. It makes coming up with any definition quite difficult. So what can we do? How can we sort of react to this difficulty? Well, okay, we've got a couple different options. Right. Option one. Maybe we just give a list of sort of properties. Maybe we say there is no definition of life. There's just a vague cluster of properties. That humans call lifelike. Right? This is vaguely the Perry view. Right? There's a vague aesthetic phenomenon that we're sort of interested in. There's not really any real conditions that specify what's in this cluster or what isn't in this cluster, right? But there's just some stuff we're into, some stuff we're not into, and we'll call those life forms. Here's another option. This is the option that goes back to that article we read, the Pillars of Life. What was his name? I'm blanking on his name now.
Koshland?
Yeah, Koshland, thank you. Thank you, yes. There is a specific determinate cluster of properties that all and only living things have. If you take the cluster together, right, the whole cluster picks out all and only the properties that living things possess. And yeah, that's Koshland. Thank you for reminding me of his name. That was what Koshland was doing, right? He was saying there are these 7 properties. These are the 7 properties. They're not just arbitrary or vaguely chosen, right? These are the real properties. They're necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be alive. Option 3, there is what I'm changing Badal's order a little bit. There's what Badal's going to do. So we'll just leave this one as a placeholder for now. And option 4, again, we're mostly going to leave this one as a placeholder too. There's the Schrodinger entropic account. We're going to leave these last two. We're going to fill out Badal's today. We'll leave this one mostly as a placeholder. We'll say a little bit about why Badal doesn't think it's particularly promising as an approach, but we'll explore it in far greater detail once we actually finish with Badal. But let's talk about these first two. So we've already seen both examples of both of these approaches. Badal thinks this first approach is basically giving up and saying, I don't know what life is. We might have to give up. We might have to just shrug our shoulders eventually, but that should be a last resort. We shouldn't start assuming that this is true about life. We should start assuming that life that really is something, that there really is some natural kind out there in the world for us to discover, and try to discover it, right? If all of our efforts fail, then we can give up, shrug our shoulders, and be piri, but we shouldn't start with that. And the reason why, in part, the clusters just seem ultimately really arbitrary and leave us wanting to know more. All right, so we can get rid of that one pretty quickly. He doesn't spend much time on that option. What about the Koshland approach? That's the more interesting one. He thinks this approach ultimately doesn't satisfy us or answer our questions. And here's why. It can't answer the question, why is the list of properties the right list of properties for life? Why do, in the case of Koshland, why do those 7 conditions, why do life forms have to obey all 7 of those conditions? What if I find something that only satisfies 6 of them? Why do I have to kick that out of the life club? What is it about the properties that gets picked out that makes it the right list of properties? But Al just doesn't think you can answer that question on the basis of a cluster model. No matter how good your cluster is, even if you come up with conditions that all and only living things possess, so genuinely necessary and sufficient conditions for a life form, even if you could come up with that list, it doesn't explain why are those necessary and sufficient conditions for life forms. That question, that more question, this why question, it really matters because he thinks there actually are real questions about life that as scientists and philosophers, we should want to answer that we can't answer. So let's just go through some of these questions. Right. Here are some of the questions he thinks that you just can't answer if you adopt that approach, that sort of approach 1 or approach 2. So here's the first one. Can things be more or less alive, or is everything alive to the same extent? That seems like a good, interesting question. And it's one you can't answer on the cluster model. All the cluster can tell you is it's alive if it has these properties, it's not alive if it doesn't. It has nothing useful to say about can things be more or less alive, or is everything either alive or not alive. So I'm going to go through these list of questions one at a time. So I just want to stop for a second and make sure. Any questions about that? Why neither of the cluster approaches work for that first question? Out of curiosity, what do you, oh, go ahead, Connor. Yeah, you should be unmuted.
For I guess the second part of the question where everything is simple.
Oops, sorry, you're breaking up a little bit.
Is this better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. For the everything being simply alive or not, is that the presumption that the cluster statements are making? Like, if you fulfill all of these traits, you are alive, and if you don't fulfill even one of them, you are not alive?
So it definitely says that. So the last thing you said is definitely right. But he actually thinks it's sort of that both of the cluster models are kind of agnostic about this question, actually. Because I could say, okay, if you have all these properties, you count as alive. But I could say, but some things have the properties more than other things do, even if they all have them to some minimal extent. Certain things display the properties to a greater extent, so some things are more alive and some things are less alive. Or I could just be more iconoclast about it and just say, no, if you satisfy any of the properties to any extent, you're fully alive. If you miss a single one, you're not alive to any extent. So it's more that he thinks they're both agnostic rather than that they're even taking a stance about which of those two options we should prefer. Does that make sense or help?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, good. All right, let's go to the second question. Question number 2. What level or levels count as alive? So what do I mean by levels? Here are some examples. DNA itself. So viruses. Viruses are just DNA, none of the cellular mechanism around them. And actually, really, viruses aren't even DNA, really, they're RNA. So let's say DNA or RNA itself. Is DNA itself alive? Are cells alive? And what if we change this? What about a single cellular organism? Is that alive? Versus cells in a more complicated organism? What about organisms? Okay, that's the obvious one. And presumably both of the clusters are only talking about clusters of properties of organisms themselves. So they're only talking on the level of organisms. What about species? Are species alive? So not just particular cows are alive, but the species cow. Can the cow species itself count as alive? What about ecosystems as a whole? Can ecosystems be called alive? What about, we'll go to our most crazy sci-fi example. What about the Gaia hypothesis? Is the Earth itself alive? Can the Earth itself count as a life form? I got a question. Does that mean the physical parts or the idea of a species or ecosystem? The way he's thinking about a species, it's a good question. The way he's thinking about species, let me actually add that as a clarification. He's thinking about species as fundamentally a system. And in particular, an evolutionary system. So is the evolutionary system cow, is that alive? So it's not necessarily even like the cow as an idea or something like that. It's like the cow as this very specific process, the species cow as this very specific process is that it gets studied in evolutionary biology. That's the one he's thinking of. So I hope that answers that question. I hope that clarifies. Which of these levels counts should we call as alive? The cluster model can't help because the cluster is only talking about individual organisms. Right? So it can't even help us ask questions about, on the one hand, the parts of organisms, or on the other hand, the sort of system that organisms are sort of embedded within. Right? It's just not even talking about those things. But we can ask really real, meaningful, interesting questions about all of those other levels too. Right? Especially the Gaia hypothesis, right? I mean, this is our most sort of sci-fi thought experiments, but like, what would need to be the case to call the planet as a whole alive in some sense? Again, the cluster model is not even going to help. It wouldn't be talking about life on that scale. All the cluster model is talking about is life on the scale of the individual organism. And Bedau thinks all of those questions are really good and interesting questions. And in fact, his answer is going to be super weird. His answer is actually going to be that organisms actually aren't fundamentally what are alive. To Bedau, actually, what's fundamentally alive is the species. And the organisms are only alive insofar as they're related to a species in some sense. So we'll get into that. That's just jumping ahead a little bit. But he thinks this is actually a really interesting question, and the cluster model doesn't let us ask it. Go ahead, Caleb.
Sorry, there's a prompt to say, like, unmute that I had to approve. So since a planet can't reproduce or it doesn't have metabolic function and anabolic functions, does that like
the Gaia
pick it out of the cluster?
The Gaia people argue it has metabolic functions, actually.
Okay.
Oh, well, we actually will need to see if that's true. We're not ready to talk about metabolism yet, seriously. We need to do the Schrodinger entropic stuff. They have a case. I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying they have a case to make that actually the planet Earth as a whole shows really weird entropic properties that perhaps are somewhat, at least maybe analogous, maybe not the same, but at least analogous to some of the entropic properties that that individual living organisms show. Whether or not they're right or not, again, that's the separate question, but they at least have some case that they can make. Really, and then that's going to be solely on, that's not going to fit in Bedau's model. The answer is very clearly going to be no, right? Planets aren't naturally selected in any sense. But if you adopt the entropic definition, you can make a case for it, at least. Does that help?
Yeah. But reproductive wise, does that
Mhm.
take it out of the Koshland's approach?
On the entropic model, you might not actually need reproduction as an essential feature of the
Okay.
world. That's what is it.
Gotcha.
That's why.
Okay.
Because if you say no, anything that metabolizes in a strict sense what we mean by metabolism, so not like a Campbell, but if we can make a really strict definition of what we mean by metabolism, anything that metabolizes is alive, whether it reproduces or not.
Okay. Cool.
And that's actually going to be said as an advantage of the view when we look at it later on, because there's a whole bunch of things that seem like they're conceptually possible that Badal are going to say are actually impossible. They're not even thinkable because of his requirement that things undergo evolutionary pressures. So we'll say a little bit more about that as we go, but I hope that's at least good enough for a sort of an initial account at least. All right. Go ahead, Rachel. You're good. You should be good.
I just wanted to ask, like, just to clarify that the option 1, 2, 3, and 4 are like, what people would consider life. Like that's the options that we're
That's
going
right.
through. Okay. And then
These are options that we can use to try to define life, given the complexity and of the phenomenon that we're trying to define. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Each of those 4 is one option, and we've seen the same basic list of 4 options before. Actually, this is basically the same list that Sagan gave us in that article. Right.
Okay.
He added a 5th one because he broke the metabolic account into 2 different ones, sort of like a bad version of metabolism and the more sophisticated version of metabolism. But it's basically the same list of options that Sagan gave us too.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to clarify that, and then I was
Absolutely.
also going to ask with like the Earth metabolic stuff, if they'd consider things like if the Big Bang were to have actually happened, that's like the theory that we're going to go off of, if that would count as kind of like the solar system, like doing different things in forms of life and stuff, like if that would be its way of like quote reproducing or whatever.
At least in principle, we could be open to that as a question at least. Right? Maybe that's not right in practice, but at least we could ask that as a question. And indeed, if we want to go back to the Aristotle thought the whole universe indeed was alive.
Okay.
He thought the universe, and it wasn't a universe for him, it was a cosmos, which they're slightly different, but nevertheless, he thought the universe was a living thing. It's the absolute living thing, he says. And again, at least in principle, we should be open to asking that as a question at least, is the universe a living thing? And we can't do that using any of the cluster models either. So yeah, you're at least articulating another question we should at the very least be able to ask. And we can't ask just on the cluster model. So does that help?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Go ahead, Connor. You should be unmuted.
Based on Badau's argument, would he consider, like, say there's an artificial intelligence that like lives for several centuries or millennia, and over that time, quote unquote, evolves itself to better fit its surroundings? Like it's an individual rather than a species responding to evolutionary pressures. Would Badau count that entity as alive?
He would not. Though we're going to see we'd have to make the scenario really specific a little bit. But he would say, no, maybe it's really cool, maybe it's interesting, maybe it says teleonomic properties, but we shouldn't call it a life form.
Okay.
Because it's not undergoing, and I just realized we have 5 minutes of class left, which is hilarious because we're like 1 page through. We're on like page 3 of the Badau article. When we turn to his view, he's going to mean something really, really specific by evolution. And the scenario you're describing just isn't what he means.
Okay.
Might be something else, might be cool, might be very interesting. Maybe it could generate a moral person, but it's not a life form.
Okay.
All right. Let me do, so since we are so close, I just realized at the end of class, third paper canceled, officially canceling the third paper because, we're going to need to we're going to get even farther behind, I think. Well, let's at least just get these questions really clear. The last question he thinks, that's a really interesting one. Is life a matter of form or matter? right? Or do the material constituents play some necessary role? Everyone agrees that the form plays some role, right? But is there also a place for the material constituents of that the life form is made out of to play a role too? And basically, what he's articulating here is actually going to be the fundamental disagreement between the entropic people and him. So he and the mayor himself actually does think there's a role for matter, but at least like people who tend to go in this more evolutionary teleonomic direction, they tend to be functionalists. They tend to say that life reduces to the functions that it demonstrates, and the precise material mechanism by which those functions are articulated is kind of irrelevant. Whereas the entropic people are going to say, no, no, no. If the goal is to maintain a specific entropic value, that is a chemical process, right? And maybe many different kinds of chemical processes can do it, but that is a specifically chemical, physical thing, not just a formal system. And so he's aware of this debate. He thinks this is a very real debate, an important debate, and he wants to suggest that it is indeed a very real and important debate, and to preserve it as a real and important debate, again, we can't just list the properties, because the properties aren't giving us anything essential to life. That's ultimately what's wrong with both of these sort of accounts. And that's what he ultimately wants. He wants to say what is essential to life, not just the list of life's properties, but what essentially is it to be alive? To put this differently, if you could answer what life essentially was, you could explain why it has to have the properties that it does. Why it has to have the necessary and sufficient conditions that it does. So why does life have to reproduce? Because if it didn't reproduce, it wouldn't be able to sort of be what life essentially is. Why does life have to metabolize? Because if it didn't, it wouldn't be what life essentially was, right? The sort of the essence of life, if you could find it, would explain why we pick out the clusters that we pick out, right? Why this is, in the Koshland case, if he's right, why is Koshland's cluster the right cluster? It's the right cluster because life has to have all of those properties to be what it essentially is. And so he thinks that both the third and fourth option are indeed efforts to try to come up with the essence of life. So they are superior to the first two. Right. So both of these options are, he thinks, way more promising candidates than the first two. He rejects, and we'll end here today. We're not going to go into any sort of great detail about why he rejects the fourth. He rejects the metabolic one because he thinks there just seem to be things that metabolize that aren't alive. And he cites as an example of vortexes in water and candles are the two examples he lists. We're just going to treat this as, yeah, that's a problem for today. It's not going to be clear, and we sort of go deeper into the Schrodinger view that this actually is that on Schrodinger's view, vortexes or candles actually do in fact metabolize in the right sense. This might not be a sophisticated enough account of metabolism, and if we came up with a more sophisticated account, we might be able to respond to this worry. But for now, at least, we'll just treat this as, yeah, this is a problem, and so we're going to need to get rid of this option. We're going to have to get rid of that. That was not a very well drawn line. Let me try drawing that line again. We're going to have to get rid of, come on, line. We're going to have to get rid of this option because, yeah, it just doesn't seem like candles or vortexes are alive, right? What we'll be left with then for our approach to find an essence, it'll be this third approach, whatever Badal's is. And I think we'll just probably start there. We'll just start at figuring out what Badal actually says next class period. So there won't be a new reading for next class. My guess is we'll need all of next class to actually finish the article because, yeah, we're like page 3. There was one last question. How does identifying an essence avoid falling into vitalism? It's a good question. It's because vitalism is saying that, if you want to put it this way, the essence is something non-physical. both the metabolic definition and what Badal is going to say, the essence isn't going to be something non-physical. It's going to be either an evolutionary process in the case of Badal's argument, or it's going to be a metabolic process in the case of the Schrodinger argument. But both of those are still fundamentally physical processes, right? They're just not reducible to their chemical or physical parts. So they're not reductive accounts, but they are still consistently physical accounts. What vitalism was sort of the suggestion that there's some like essence of life that's not itself physical or chemical in some way. So life is made out of something different, some different kind of stuff, or there's some different special kind of energy in it. And neither of these two accounts that we're going to say are plausible are going to make that mistake. They're going to avoid that mistake. They're still both basically going to be physical still. All right, so we're at the end of class for today. So yeah, the third paper has been canceled. I'll send out an email with all the specifics about that and changes to the syllabus and the basis of it. But we're going to be so far behind there's no point. We'll cancel the third paper. We're going to shorten the third unit to just maybe a couple weeks at the end of the semester for fun. And we'll just keep going with this life stuff for a while because yeah, we're going to need to do so. So there won't be a new reading for next class period, so there also won't be a daily assignment for next class period. All we'll do on Tuesday is we'll just finish the Badal article, so you can feel free to maybe review it if you'd like. And yeah, we'll go from there. We should be able to finish it next class, I think, and then we'll turn to the entropic models, and we'll probably need a week and a half or so to go through the entropic account. So that's my plan. I'll unmute so the class is dismissed, obviously. I'll unmute everyone if people want to hang around and chat for a little bit. Otherwise, have a great weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.